The Secret Held in Cell 4, the archive of a forgotten incident. In the summer of 1987, a corrections officer at a medium-security prison in rural Ohio made what the paperwork would later call a routine discovery. Inside Cell 4 of Block C, he found a loose concrete slab near the back wall, and underneath it, a box. Sound, paper rustling, hands carefully lifting aged pages. Not a weapon, not drugs, not anything the training manuals had prepared him for. Hundreds of handwritten pages, letters, names, dates, diagrams, and what appeared to be a meticulous, years-long record of events that the prison administration had never officially acknowledged. Events that, according to those pages, had been happening for a very long time. The officer filed a report. The report was reviewed by supervisors. And then, quietly, without explanation, without a press conference or an investigation or a single public statement, the box was logged as miscellaneous personal property and transferred to an off-site storage facility. No follow-up, no inquiry, no record that anyone asked what was inside it. Music rises, understated, deliberate, documentary style. For nearly 3 decades, that box sat in a storage room, largely forgotten by everyone except the man who created it. This is the story of what was inside it, and why it matters more today than it did the day it was found. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The prison at the end of the road. Aerial footage, flat farmland, a gravel road cutting through open fields, a cluster of low concrete buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing. Sound, wind across open fields, gravel crunching under tires, a chain-link fence rattling. Morrow County, Ohio, 1979. To understand what happened inside Cell 4, you first have to understand the place that surrounded it. The Harfield Correctional Facility was opened in the spring of 1979. Its name appears in almost no major historical records. No famous cases were tried there. No riots made the national news. No documentaries were produced about its operations. It existed in the way that many American prisons of that era existed, quietly, at the end of a long road, far from the attention of the cities that sent men to fill its cells. It was built during a wave of prison expansion that swept across the United States in the late 1970s. The country was responding to rising crime rates, new mandatory sentencing laws, and a political climate that increasingly saw incarceration as the primary answer to social disorder. Cells were filling faster than the system could build them, and state governments were under pressure to add capacity, quickly and cheaply. Harfield wasn't designed for the most dangerous offenders. It wasn't a maximum security operation. It was a medium security facility built for men who had been convicted of crimes that fell somewhere in the middle, not violent enough to be sent upstate, not minor enough to avoid serious time. Drug offenses, burglary, fraud, parole violations, the kind of cases that fill courtrooms every day across America and rarely make the evening news. Camera, slow pan along a perimeter fence. Guard towers visible in the background. The facility sat on land that had previously been used for farming, flat, open, and deliberately remote. The nearest town was roughly 12 miles away. The nearest major city was over an hour by car. This was not accidental. Prison placement in rural America during this period followed a familiar pattern. Small counties wanted the jobs. State governments wanted land that was cheap. And the correctional system wanted facilities that were, in a very practical sense, out of sight. At its peak, Harfield employed somewhere between 80 and 110 staff, corrections officers, administrative personnel, medical staff, and maintenance workers. It housed approximately 340 inmates. By almost every measurable standard, it was unremarkable. And that, as we'll come to understand, was a significant part of the problem. Music tightened slightly, still restrained, but with a new edge beneath it. When a prison becomes ordinary, when it settles into routine, the people inside it begin to exist in a kind of closed world. A world with its own rules, its own culture, its own way of managing conflict and covering mistakes. Sometimes that works. Sometimes the people inside a facility develop a sense of professionalism and order that serves everyone, including the men being held there. But sometimes, when oversight is inconsistent, when the facility sits far enough from public view, when the internal culture begins to drift, Things go wrong in ways that never get recorded anywhere. At Harfield, between the years of 1981 and 1987, something went wrong. We may never know the full picture, but we know considerably more than the official record suggests because of what one man decided to write down. Sound: a pen scratching paper. Slow and deliberate. His name was Raymond Elias Cobb. He was 34 years old when he arrived at Harfield in March of 1981, convicted on a nonviolent fraud charge, a check-kiting scheme that had unraveled over the course of a federal investigation. His sentence was 7 years. With good behavior, he was expected to serve closer to 5. He was assigned to Block C. He was assigned to Cell 4. And from the very first week of his incarceration, Raymond Cobb began to write. The man in Cell 4. Camera. Tight shot on a blank sheet of paper. A hand enters frame. Picks up a pencil. Sound: a metal bunk creaking. Ambient noise of a cell block in the background. Distant voices, doors, footsteps. Raymond Cobb was not the kind of man who typically becomes the center of a story like this. He wasn't a trained whistleblower. He wasn't an activist or a journalist or someone with a legal background. Before his arrest, he had spent most of his adult life working as a mid-level accountant for a small manufacturing firm in Columbus, Ohio. He had a modest apartment, a car, a small circle of friends, and a life that was, by all accounts, quietly ordinary, until the choices he made began to catch up with him. He never minimized what he had done. In letters from that period, he acknowledged that his actions had been wrong, that he had violated trust, and that the consequences he faced were ones he understood. He was not a man who felt he had been wrongly placed behind those walls. What he didn't anticipate was what he would witness once he was inside them. Sound: a corridor filling with voices. A steel door slamming in the distance. Cobb was, by nature, an observer. His years in accounting had trained him to notice patterns, to track numbers, sequences, and discrepancies, to sense, almost instinctively, when something in a system didn't add up. And at Harfield, things didn't add up almost from the beginning. His early writings described the first weeks of incarceration as disorienting but not immediately alarming. He was learning the rhythms of prison life: meal schedules, yard time, work assignments, the informal hierarchy that exists in every facility, the personalities of the officers who rotated through Block C. He describes some of those officers as professional and measured, others as indifferent, going through the motions of a job they no longer thought much about, and a small number as something more troubling, men whose conduct, in Cobb's careful documentation, raised serious questions. His earliest notes are almost clinical in their tone. Dates, times, names he heard spoken aloud, behaviors he witnessed in common areas, conversations that carried through thin walls or across the open space of a corridor. He wasn't building a case. Not consciously. Not yet. He was simply doing what came naturally to him. He was keeping records. Music, quiet, methodical, like a metronome ticking beneath still water. The writing began. Cobb later explained to a paralegal who would eventually become central to this story, as a form of psychological survival. Prison, for someone not accustomed to it, can be profoundly destabilizing. The loss of control over your own time, the constant noise, the physical proximity to conflict and tension, all of it creates a kind of pressure that different people manage in different ways. Cobb managed it by writing. He requested paper through the standard commissary system. Nothing unusual about that. Inmates regularly received writing materials, for letters to family, for legal correspondence, for personal use. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked twice at a man writing quietly in his cell. What nobody knew was the volume. Over 6 years, from 1981 to his release in 1987, Raymond Cobb filled what would eventually amount to several hundred pages. He wrote in a small, deliberate hand, conserving every inch of space. He developed his own shorthand for names he considered sensitive, a precaution against the material being searched and identified. He organized everything by date, by location within the facility, and by category. He called it his archive, and he kept it hidden beneath a loose concrete slab in the floor of Cell 4. Sound: the slow, careful scrape of stone shifting against stone. When Cobb walked out of Harfield in the spring of 1987, having served just over 6 years, he carried some of the pages with him, the ones he judged most critical, the ones small enough to leave without drawing attention. But the bulk of the archive, the physical record accumulated across 6 years of careful, consistent observation, stayed behind, sealed beneath the floor of the cell he had lived in longer than some people live in an apartment. He intended to come back for it. He had a plan, he later said, a legal strategy, a way to retrieve the material through proper channels once he was out and had access to counsel. But life moved quickly. The adjustment to the outside world consumed him, and the box remained where he had left it. Until 3 months later, when a corrections officer making a routine check noticed something wasn't right with the floor. A long beat of silence. What happened to that box after it was found? Where it went? Who saw it? And why it quietly disappeared into a storage system rather than triggering any formal response, is a question that took years to fully answer. But the answer begins in a legal aid office in Cincinnati. 4 years after the box was discovered, and a full decade after the events it documented had first begun. The document that arrived in the mail. Camera, a modest office interior. Fluorescent lighting. Stacked files. A desk cluttered with folders and correspondence. Sound. Office ambience. A phone ringing somewhere down a hallway. The soft rhythm of work being done. In the winter of 1991, a paralegal named Sandra Merritt was working at a small legal aid organization in Cincinnati, Ohio. The organization provided free and low-cost legal assistance to individuals who couldn't afford private representation. It was underfunded, overworked, and staffed almost entirely by people who stayed because they believed the work mattered. Merritt had been there 3 years. She handled intake interviews, assisted attorneys with case preparation, and managed a significant portion of the office's incoming mail. On a Tuesday morning in February of 1991, an envelope arrived that didn't fit any of the usual categories. Sound. An envelope being opened carefully, deliberate, unhurried. It was postmarked from a small town in eastern Ohio. There was no return address. Inside were 7 handwritten pages and a brief typed cover letter. The cover letter identified the sender only as a former resident of Harfield, CF. No name, no contact information, no explanation of how the writer had found the organization or why they had chosen to reach out. The 7 pages were dense, precise. They described specific dates, specific incidents, and what the writer referred to as systematic failures of documentation inside the facility, a pattern of events between 1982 and 1986 that had never appeared in any official record. Merritt read the pages twice before she stood up from her desk. Sound. Footsteps crossing a hallway. A door opening. She brought the letter directly to the supervising attorney she reported to, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had spent years handling cases that touched the correctional system. Wrongful convictions, civil rights violations, conditions of confinement claims. She had seen a great deal of what the prison system produced when things went wrong. Holloway later described her first reaction to the letter as cautious interest. Allegations against correctional facilities were not unusual in her line of work. They arrived regularly, through formal filings, through family members of incarcerated individuals, through inmates themselves. Many were legitimate. Some were exaggerated. A portion were fabricated entirely, submitted by men who believed, correctly or not, that the legal system could be moved by sheer volume of complaint. The challenge was always the same. Documentation. Without verifiable, specific documentation, without names, dates, corroborating witnesses, physical evidence, even genuine allegations struggled to survive the scrutiny of a formal legal process. Music enters, quiet, deliberate, carefully building. What made these 7 pages different was the texture of their detail. The writer cited exact dates, named specific officers by first name and last initial, a level of specificity that suggested genuine, direct familiarity with the facility rather than vague accusation assembled from rumor. Described particular incidents with the kind of precision, time of day, location within the block, the sequence of actions, the words spoken, that is extraordinarily difficult to fabricate convincingly without having been there. Holloway read the pages slowly, making notes in the margin of her own legal pad. And then, at the bottom of the final page, she found a sentence that stopped her. The writer mentioned a box, hidden beneath cell 4, containing a far more complete record than anything the letter described. Sound. A pen setting down on a desk. Silence. That detail changed everything. If the box was real, if it had been found by facility staff and entered into the property system, as the writer seemed to suggest, then it existed as a document of record. It was, in theory, something that could be accessed, requested, subpoenaed through the proper legal channels if necessary. Physical evidence has a way of surviving in legal proceedings that testimony alone rarely can. But before any of that could happen, Holloway and Merritt had to answer a more fundamental question. Was the box real? And who had written the letter? Camera. Slow zoom on the inside cover letter. The final line reads, "What is in that box has not gone away. It is waiting." Tracing an anonymous letter from an unnamed former inmate at a rural Ohio facility, with no return address, no signature, and no identifying details beyond a postmark, was not a straightforward task. It would take Merritt and Holloway several months of careful, methodical work. The trail went cold more than once. There were dead ends, incorrect assumptions, and at least one instance where they were certain they had found their man and were wrong. But in the summer of 1991, they found him. Raymond Elias Cobb was living in a modest rental home in a mid-sized Ohio city, working a bookkeeping job he had found through a reentry program. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, spoken publicly about his time at Harfield. He had not filed any legal complaints. He had not reached out to journalists or advocacy organizations. He had simply been living quietly, waiting. When Merritt called him and explained who she was and what she did, the line was silent for a long moment. Then Cobb said, "I wondered how long it would take someone to find me." Music fades to a low, sustained tone. The meeting took place 3 weeks later in a conference room at the legal aid office. Cobb arrived on time, carrying a folder. He was calm, composed, not eager to perform or to persuade. He spoke the way someone speaks when they've been holding information for a very long time and have thought carefully about exactly how they want to share it. He confirmed that the box existed. He confirmed that it had been in cell for when he left. And he confirmed, without hesitation, that what was inside it was more extensive and more serious than anything those 7 pages had conveyed. What he told Holloway and Merritt that afternoon, in a windowless conference room on a Wednesday in late July, would take the better part of 3 hours. And it would reshape everything they thought they understood about what had happened inside Harfield Correctional Facility during the years Raymond Cobb had lived inside its walls. Sound fades completely. Silence. Chapter 4. What the archive contained. Camera. A conference room. A wooden table. 2 paper cups of coffee, one untouched. A legal pad covered in handwritten notes. Cobb sits across from Holloway and Merritt, his folder open in front of him. Sound. The faint hum of fluorescent lighting. A clock on the wall. Outside, distant city traffic. Raymond Cobb did not begin with the most serious things. That was the detail Holloway would later say she remembered most clearly about that first meeting. Not the gravity of what he eventually described, but the methodical, almost unhurried way he approached it. He started at the beginning. He laid a foundation. He treated the conversation the way a careful accountant treats a complex audit, building from the ground up, making sure every layer was understood before moving to the next. He began with the structure of the archive itself. Sound. Papers being carefully turned. The material in the box, he explained, was organized into 4 sections. He had labeled them himself, in the shorthand he had developed during his first year at Harfield. The first section covered what he called operational irregularities, his term for day-to-day practices within Block C that deviated from what he understood to be standard correctional procedure. Scheduling anomalies. Discrepancies between official logs and what he had personally observed happening on the block. Instances where documentation appeared to have been completed inaccurately or not completed at all. As a trained accountant, Cobb had an instinct for the gap between what a record says and what actually occurred. In a financial context, that gap is called a discrepancy. In a prison context, he had come to understand it was something with considerably higher stakes. Music enters, low and measured. He walked Holloway through specific examples. There were nights, he said, when the official count log, the record of which inmates were in their cells during mandatory count periods, reflected numbers that didn't match what he could directly observe from his own cell. Not by large margins. By 1 or 2. Enough to be dismissed as a clerical error if it happened once. Not enough to dismiss when it happened consistently, over months, in patterns that repeated. There were maintenance records he had become aware of, through conversations with inmates who worked facility maintenance as part of their work assignment, that logged repairs and inspections of certain areas of the block that, according to those same inmates, had never actually taken place. And there were incident reports, or more precisely, the absence of incident reports, for events that Cobb had directly witnessed and expected to generate formal documentation. Holloway stopped him at that point. "What kind of incidents?" she asked. Cobb was quiet for a moment. "That's the second section," he said. Camera. Slow push toward the folder on the table. Cobb's hand rests on top of it. The second section of the archive was the one that had driven Cobb to begin organizing his notes into a formal system in the first place. He called it, in his shorthand, UC, for unrecorded conduct. He was careful in how he described it. He was not, he told Holloway, making accusations he couldn't support with specific, documented observations. He was not relying on rumors that circulated among inmates, of which there were always many, and which he had learned early on to treat with significant skepticism. He was describing only what he had personally witnessed, or what had been directly reported to him by individuals he named specifically and whose accounts he had been able to partially corroborate through his own observations. What he described fell into several categories. The first involved the use of what he termed informal discipline, actions taken by a small number of officers against inmates that did not go through the formal disciplinary process the facility was required by state regulations to follow. The formal process existed for a reason. It created a paper trail, required supervisory review, and gave the inmate an opportunity to respond. The informal process created none of those things. Cobb documented specific instances, dates, locations, the names of officers involved, the names of inmates affected, in which disciplinary responses had been administered outside the official system. Some of these involved the denial of privileges or access that inmates were entitled to. Others were more direct. He did not use dramatic language. He listed what he had seen, when he had seen it, and who had been present. Sound. Holloway's pen moving steadily across her legal pad. The second category under this section involved access, specifically, who had access to certain areas of the facility outside of normal operational hours, and why that access was being used. Cobb had been a light sleeper for most of his incarceration, a fact he attributed partly to the noise of the block and partly to the anxiety that never fully left him during his years inside. As a result, he had observed things during nighttime hours that the daytime record did not reflect. He described movement patterns, specific officers entering and exiting areas of the block at hours that didn't correspond to any shift schedule he had been able to reconstruct. He described interactions between staff and certain inmates that occurred outside the normal supervised framework of the facility. Again, he was precise. He gave dates. He gave approximate times. He named people. Music deepened slightly, not dramatic, but weighted. The third category was the one that Holloway would later describe as the most legally significant, not because it was the most serious in human terms, but because it was the most potentially actionable. Cobb had documented what appeared to be a pattern of property handling that didn't align with the facility's own stated procedures. When an inmate at Harfield received a formal disciplinary citation, or when an inmate's cell was searched, there was a process. Items found or confiscated were supposed to be logged, itemized, and stored according to specific protocols. An inmate had the right to know what had been taken and why. Cobb's record suggested that this process was not being consistently followed, that items were being removed from cells and from inmates without formal logging, that in some cases, property that should have appeared on a confiscation record never did. He had tracked this not only through his own experience, but through the accounts of other inmates, men he had spoken to carefully and selectively over years, whose specific claims he had cross-referenced against whatever observable evidence he could gather. The pattern he had identified was not random. It was concentrated around a specific period, roughly 1983 to 1985, and it was concentrated around a specific group of staff members whose names appeared repeatedly across multiple sections of the archive. Beat. How many names? Merritt asked. Cobb picked up the folder, opened it, and turned it to face them. On a single sheet of paper, written in his small, precise hand, were the names of 6 individuals. 5 corrections officers. 1 administrative staff member. The room was quiet for a moment. Camera, wide shot of the conference room. The afternoon light has shifted. The untouched coffee cup is still where it was. Holloway set down her pen. She had been in this field long enough to understand the distance between allegation and proof, the enormous, sometimes insurmountable gap between what someone believed had happened and what could be established through a legal process. She had seen cases that appeared airtight dissolve under scrutiny. She had seen cases that appeared thin gradually accumulate enough documented support to become something real. What Cobb was describing occupied a space she recognized. It was serious, it was specific, and it was almost entirely dependent, at this stage, on the physical archive, the box, the pages, the 6 years of handwritten documentation still sitting in an off-site storage facility associated with a prison that, for all she knew, had no idea what it actually contained. She asked him about the remaining 2 sections. Sound, Cobb shifting in his chair. A slow exhale. The 3rd section, he explained, was what he called his corroboration record. Over the course of his time at Harfield, he had identified 8 other inmates whose accounts of specific events aligned with his own observations. He had not told any of them about the archive. He had not coordinated his documentation with theirs. He had simply listened and written down what they said, alongside what he had personally observed. Some of those men were still incarcerated, as far as he knew. Some had been released. He had been able to locate 2 of them since his own release. Both had declined, when he approached them cautiously, to discuss Harfield. He had not pressed them. He understood why someone might want to leave that chapter behind. But their names and the specific accounts they had given him during the years they had shared a facility were in the archive, preserved exactly as they had described them. The 4th section was the smallest. Cobb called it, simply, questions I cannot answer. It was a list, not of incidents, but of gaps. Things he had observed that he could not explain with any certainty. Patterns that suggested something, but didn't give him enough information to characterize it clearly. Events where his documentation was incomplete because he had only partial visibility into what had occurred. He included it, he told Holloway, because he thought intellectual honesty required it. He wasn't willing to present the archive as more complete than it was. There were things he didn't know. There were things he might have misinterpreted. He wanted that on record alongside everything else. Music rises, then settles. Holloway looked at Merritt. Then she looked back at Cobb. You kept this for 6 years, she said. You hid it. You organized it. You left it behind when you were released, and then you waited 4 years before reaching out to anyone. Why now? Cobb was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the folder on the table. Because I heard, he said, that one of the men on that list just got promoted. Silence. The clock on the wall continues. Sound fades. 6 names on a page. A coffee maker finishing its cycle somewhere down the hall. Patricia Holloway had not slept particularly well. That wasn't unusual for her. The nature of her work had always had a way of following her home, settling into the hours between midnight and dawn when the mind tends to run without supervision. But the night after her meeting with Raymond Cobb had been different. Not anxious, exactly. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something large and trying to accurately measure its dimensions before stepping forward. She had been doing this work for 11 years. She knew the difference between a case that felt significant and a case that actually was. She also knew that those 2 things did not always overlap. What she kept returning to, in the quiet of that early morning, was the last thing Cobb had said before he left. One of the men on that list just got promoted. She hadn't asked him which one. She had been too focused in the moment on the broader scope of what he had described, and by the time the thought fully formed, he was already standing to leave. She had his phone number. She would call him. But first she needed to understand exactly what she was looking at. She opened her legal pad to the notes she had taken the day before and began, methodically, at the beginning. Sound, papers turning, a pen uncapping, camera, a series of shots, a telephone directory, a state government employee database printout, a hand writing names in a column. The 6 names Cobb had given her were not, on their surface, remarkable. 5 corrections officers, 1 administrative staff member. All of them, as far as Cobb had been able to determine during his time at Harfield, still employed by the facility as of his release in 1987. Whether they were still there 4 years later, in 1991, was the first question she needed to answer. Holloway had developed, over her years of work, a practical understanding of how to research individuals connected to state correctional systems without triggering any premature attention. Public employee records, state personnel directories, union membership rolls, which were sometimes accessible through labor board filings. facility newsletters, and internal publications, which occasionally listed staff recognitions, promotions, and retirements. It was slow work. It required patience and precision, the same qualities, she reflected, that had apparently driven Raymond Cobb to fill several hundred pages over 6 years. She started with what was most accessible: music, quiet, methodical, the sound of careful work being done. By mid-morning, she had confirmed the current employment status of 3 of the 6 names. The first, a corrections officer Cobb had identified only by the name Gerald H. in his shorthand, had retired from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction in 1989. His name appeared in a brief notice in a regional union publication from that year, thanking him for his years of service. He was, as far as the public record was concerned, a private citizen. The second name, a woman Cobb had identified as the administrative staff member, referred to in his notes as D. Fairman, no longer appeared in any current state employee directory. Whether she had resigned, been dismissed, or transferred to a different agency wasn't immediately clear. She had simply, from the perspective of the public record, stopped being present. The third name was different. His name was Thomas Whirl. Cobb had referred to him throughout the archive. Merritt had noted during their meeting, more frequently than any other individual. He appeared across multiple sections of the documentation, in the operational irregularities, in the unrecorded conduct entries, and in the corroboration record, where at least 3 of the 8 inmates Cobb had noted had mentioned him by name independently of one another. Thomas Whirl was not retired. He had not quietly disappeared from the public record. As of the spring of 1991, Thomas Whirl had been appointed to the position of assistant superintendent at a different Ohio correctional facility, a larger, higher-profile institution than Harfield. The appointment had been made 6 months earlier, in the fall of 1990. It had been noted in an internal Department of Rehabilitation and Correction bulletin as a recognition of his years of dedicated service and demonstrated leadership. Beat. The pen stops moving. Holloway sat back in her chair. She read the bulletin entry a second time, then a third. Demonstrated leadership. She wrote Whirl's name at the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice. Camera. Merritt arriving at the office, stopping in the doorway of Holloway's office. She reads Holloway's expression before anything is said. Sound. A door opening. Footsteps. Merritt had spent the previous evening pursuing a parallel line of inquiry, one that Holloway had assigned her at the end of their meeting with Cobb, and which she had approached with the same careful, methodical energy she brought to most things. The box. Specifically, where was it now, and what was its current legal status? This required navigating the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections property and evidence management system, a process that was, in practice, considerably less straightforward than it should have been. State agencies were not always forthcoming with information requests, particularly when those requests touched on matters related to closed facilities or archived records from years past. There were procedures, forms, channels that had to be followed in the correct sequence, by the correct people, using the correct language. Merritt had done this before. She knew which doors to knock on. What she had found, after several hours of careful inquiry, was both encouraging and immediately complicated. Sound. Merritt setting a folder on Holloway's desk. The box did exist in the official record. It had been logged on September 14, 1987, approximately 3 months after Cobb's release, under a property intake number assigned to the Harfield facility. The intake record described the contents as miscellaneous handwritten personal papers, quantity undetermined. It listed the item as having been transferred to an off-site storage facility operated under contract by the Ohio Department of Administrative Services. The item was still there. It had not been destroyed, had not been transferred again, and had not, as far as the available records showed, been accessed since the day it was logged. That was the encouraging part. The complicated part was the intake record itself. Music shifts, a subtle increase in tension, still restrained. The officer who had filed the original intake report, the corrections officer who had found the box in September of 1987, had done so under a standard lost and found property protocol. This was the mechanism typically used for items found in cells after an inmate's release. Personal belongings left behind, clothing, books, letters from family. Items that had sentimental or personal value, but no formal evidentiary significance. By logging the box under that protocol, whoever had reviewed and approved the intake report had, whether deliberately or not, placed the archive into a bureaucratic category that significantly complicated any attempt to access it through legal channels. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't contraband. It wasn't part of any active investigation. It was, officially, lost property. And lost property belonging to a former inmate who had been released years ago existed in a kind of legal limbo, technically belonging to the inmate, technically held by the state, and technically accessible only through a process that required coordination between multiple state agencies, each with its own procedures and timeline. How long? Holloway asked, when Merritt finished walking her through it. Merritt sat down across from her. To do it cleanly? Without triggering anything that tips off the facility or the department before we're ready. Months. Possibly longer. Silence. And if someone inside the department becomes aware that we're asking about it? Merritt didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. They both understood what the risk was. A box that had been quietly filed away for 4 years could, if the wrong person became aware of the inquiry, just as quietly disappear. Records could be amended. Transfer logs could reflect a disposal that had never actually occurred. In the bureaucratic machinery of a state agency, paper trails could be rerouted in ways that were difficult to challenge after the fact. They needed to move carefully, but they also needed to move. Camera. Late afternoon. Holloway at her desk, the phone to her ear. The window behind her shows a sky shifting toward evening. Sound. A phone ringing. Once. Twice. A click as the line connects. Cobb answered on the third ring. Holloway told him what she had found about Whirl. She kept it factual. No speculation, no editorial. She described the appointment, the title, the facility. She asked him, directly, whether Whirl had been the name he was referring to the day before. The line was quiet for a moment. Yes, Cobb said. Holloway asked him one more question, the one she had been turning over since early that morning. In the 6 years he had spent documenting everything he'd observed at Harfield, in all the hundreds of pages that made up the archive, what was the single most important thing in that box? If everything else were lost, and only one section survived, what would he need the world to see? Cobb was quiet for a long time, long enough that she briefly wondered if the connection had dropped. Then he said, there's a set of dates. 14 of them, over about 18 months. Each one has a name next to it. And next to each name, there's a notation about what was supposed to happen to that person, procedurally, legally, according to the state's own rules, and what actually happened instead. He paused. Those 14 entries are the ones I spent the most time verifying. The ones I went back to check multiple times because I wanted to be certain I wasn't wrong. I wasn't wrong. The quality of the silence on the line changes. Whatever happens with the rest of it, Cobb said, those 14 entries are what matters. Sound fades slowly. The evening light through the window dims. There is a particular kind of story that doesn't end when the telling stops. Raymond Cobb spent 6 years writing in a cell that most people will never see, about events that most people will never know occurred. He wasn't writing for an audience. He wasn't writing for recognition. He was writing because something in him, the part that had spent a career tracking numbers and noticing when they didn't balance, refused to let the record stand uncorrected. He hid what he had written under a concrete floor. He walked out of a prison and tried to rebuild a life. And he waited, quietly, for someone to ask the right questions. Patricia Holloway and Sandra Merritt were not investigators. They were not journalists or federal agents or people with the institutional power to compel answers from a state bureaucracy. They were 2 people working in an underfunded office who read a letter carefully and decided it deserved a serious response. That decision, the simple act of taking something seriously when it would have been easier not to, is where most stories like this one either begin or end. For this one, it was a beginning. The box in the off-site storage facility still held its contents. 14 entries, 6 names, hundreds of pages of careful, methodical documentation assembled by a man who understood that the difference between something happening and something being recorded is often the difference between accountability and silence. Thomas Whirl was, as of the summer of 1991, settling into a new role at a larger facility. His promotion had been noted in an internal bulletin as a recognition of demonstrated leadership. The archive had not yet been retrieved. The questions had not yet been answered, but they had been asked. And in cases like this one, In the long, slow, unglamorous work of accountability, that is almost always where it starts. Camera. A final, slow push toward the legal pad on the table. Holloway's handwriting fills the page. Dates, names, a column of notes. At the top, underlined twice. WRL. The Harfield archive was formally requested through legal channels in the fall of 1991. Its retrieval took 14 months. What it contained prompted a review by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction that lasted nearly 2 years. Raymond Elias Cobb was never charged with any additional crimes. He died in 2009, at the age of 62, in the same city where he had rebuilt his life after leaving Harfield. He kept writing until the end.